All right, welcome everyone to the October IGRI research seminar. My name is Formand. I'm the coordinator for the IGRI, and our presenter for this month is Dan Detzi. So Dan Detzi received his PhD earlier this year from the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. He is currently an instructor of political science at the United States Air Force Academy, and his presentation today is titled Bureaucracies at War, Using Institutional Grammar and Network Analysis to Examine National Security Decision Making During Counterinsurgencies. Dan, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. And I'll attempt to share once more. Okay, can everyone see that? Or okay, good. All right, well, welcome. And again, as I was telling Uta, this is a product of my dissertation, which was ended 6 months ago. So I'm still I had to reach into the archives of my memory for some of these concepts and theories. So forgive me if I leave something out or don't explain something fully. Please feel free to ask me about it at the end, and I can clarify or hope to clarify. I think my dissertation is posted on the IGRI website, or at least the title. I also have it on ResearchGate, so if you want to take a look, it's in there. I appreciate any feedback at the end here. It's always nerve-wracking presenting to the IGRI community since I'm relatively new to the game. So I hope that I add something though with this research, which is looking at national security institutions, but also coding in the IG third-party interviews, which has its own challenges to develop kind of a look at informal institutions or informal networks, decision-making networks. So that was the exciting part of this research for me, and I really enjoy it, and I'm continuing with that work to include a working group in IGRI that's looking at informal institutions, how to code interviews, whether they're direct interviews or third party. So UTA is a big part of that, as well as Irena Perez Ibarra and others. So hopefully continue with this research. So today I'm just going to give you, I might rush through some of these slides because it is, again, a little bit longer than I wanted for this. So in true Dan Detzi fashion, I tried to cut things out, but I added some slides. So it's similar to my papers and when I try to edit. So forgive me for that. So today I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of my research motivation, the questions, the theoretical foundations, and then really look into the research design, how I use the IG to map and compare formal and informal networks, decision making within the national security construct, using the war in the insurgency or counterinsurgency in Afghanistan as a case study for the informal networks. So I compare these networks at the end, kind of look at cooperation and coordination. And then I'll briefly give you the results and some of the discussion and some of the policy implications and future research along this line. All right. So some of my motivation for this comes from two areas. One is I was in the military for over 20 years and I participated in counterinsurgencies as an operator in the Air Force and also as a practitioner. So I spent some time in the Joint Staff, which is the big staff under the chairman of the Joint Staff, but really working with the interagency, which are the other agencies and departments within the executive branch of the U.S. government. So State Department, USAID, all those agencies that are involved with national security, not just Department of Defense. So in both these areas of experience, I formulated just questions in my mind about obviously how the world works, but specifically when engaging in insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, but also organizational interactions within the national government. So this is what really piqued my interest in this realm. Academically, it was kind of a path I took academically that got me interested in this to include institutional analysis, specifically decision making, defense decision making. So research like Graham Allison, Amy Zegart got me interested in those kind of dynamics Also, the microdynamics of conflict. When I got into the grad school and the PhD program, we really looked at um, how rebel groups go after um, collective action problems, but not from the government standpoint necessarily. So I kind of want to take that microdynamic look and focus it on national government rather than the insurgents or the rebels. Um, Also in my PhD program, I was fortunate enough to take an introductory course to public policy, where I got introduced to Eleanor Ostrom's AID framework and others, obviously. So the idea of institutional analysis from public policy, bringing it into the national security analysis realm made perfect sense to me when I took the class. It just kind of gelled. So, and then obviously from there, the lure of institutional grammar and network analysis. Institutional grammar mainly because I'm really interested in well, I'm a firm believer that words have meaning, and when they're put in black and white, they do form this picture, this structure, this institution, and also informal institutions formed by interaction. So, institutional grammar was kind of a natural fit for me, and I really like it. So I put all this together into this area of research and continue to um, use it in my research going forward. So. Forgive me if there you go. Got some stuff covering up there. All right. So my questions coming out of this are the broader question going in was how do interactions between bureaucratic organizations shape strategic decision making? So there's more of an exploratory research, more descriptive. It's not looking for causal mechanisms. So two of the main two sub questions: how are formal decision making mechanisms arranged within the national security arena, and how might these organizational interactions affect policy outcomes during long-term conflicts, such as counterinsurgencies? Um, so I'm really trying, I see the black box of the US government or it could be any government. Um, what I'm trying to do is open up that black box and look at the mechanisms that are turning in there that formulate decision making. Yep. There we go. So the evolution of this research first, and I presented here a couple years ago, I think, on my first phase of this, which was looking at the formal institutions of national security based on the 1947 National Security Act and the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act. Both are legislation that formed the national security institutions. 1947 basically shaped it, created the Department of Defense. It formalized lines of interaction between the different organizations within the Department of Defense and say the president's office, the White House. And the 1986 uh, legislation was reformed to that because that system wasn't working as well as it was designed, or maybe it was, and it just wasn't working well. So 1986 was a big reform to that. So I took both of those and looked into them, coded them, created a network, a formal network, looked at rule type dispersal, and that's what I presented earlier. But from there, I wanted to do interviews with regards to counterterrorism in the Sahel region of Africa, because that's where I worked on policy. But unfortunately, when you try to set up interviews in that as a PhD student and you're not getting responses, you have to sometimes just cut bait and go to plan B, which I'm very happy I did, because I had the Afghanistan papers as my plan B. And what those are, if you're not familiar, is interviews by an organization called the Special Inspector General of Afghan Reconstruction. So a government inspector group that interviewed everyone from top policymakers all the way down to commanders on the ground about what was going on in Afghanistan, especially the flaws and coordination and communication, because obviously our strategies were failing or not working. These interviews were made possible by the Washington Post FOIAs that came out. They sued to get these out from the government because they were held classified, and so they declassified them for the Washington Post. And luckily for me, the Washington Post organized them, put them online, and I was able to access these interviews. So with that, I was able to then compare the formal networks, not only from the national security legislation, but the formal interactions that were mandated by what were called national security presidential directives from George W. Bush all the way up through um, President Biden that told how the interagency should interact or organize for the not only the war in Afghanistan, but for the entire gambit of counterterrorism at the time. So that gave me the kind of another formal network to look at and then compare it to the informal network that pops up via these interviews. So I compare those at the end. Okay, with that said, I'm just going to briefly go over my theoretical foundations. I don't need to go too deep into this, but really it's organizational theory and bureaucratic behavior. I dig deep into the archives and bring out the Selznick model from his research on the Tennessee Valley Authority and add a few things to it. So this is a simplified model talking about how bureaucratic organizations interact to where these organizations are given a specialization. When they get this specialization, they tend to seek autonomy because they are the experts at it. Sometimes they overlap, their expertise overlaps with other organizations. So this is where you get kind of a polycentric effect. So it's a continual back and forth between the overarching authority, in this case, say the president within the executive branch or the White House, and these bureaucratic organizations within the executive branch, fighting to maintain their mission, their autonomy, and not really cooperating with other agencies that might have overlapping responsibilities. So their fight basically for autonomy leads to them creating informal rules, ways of coordinating maybe with other agencies, but not cooperating. And that's a continual struggle because in the top, with regards to, say, reform legislation, creates more formal rules that tries to bring in, kind of rein in that autonomy to really force cooperation. So this is the theoretical model I go off of. Um, and I go on to define these counterinsurgencies as collective action problems. So when you're talking about bureaucratic organizational interactions in counterinsurgencies from the top to the bottom, um, it's really a collective action issue and a problem that intervenes here. So polycentric arrangements I discuss that in this case tend to exacerbate collective action problems. And then cooperation and coordination problems as kind of described by Prisoner's Dilemma or Stag Hunt, or even deconfliction games like driving on the right in the right lane or left, depending on what country we live in. So I don't go into game theory in the research, but I kind of use it as reference to talk about what cooperation and coordination problems look like and paint that onto the national security institutions. So this is, I don't want to read too much. I underlined here what I wanted to kind of pull out of here. So how do network structure and rule types tell the story here? Really going off that theoretical model, if national security institutions were meant to or designed to curtail organizational autonomy, then there should be a higher level of reciprocal or cooperative interactions. Um, and then rules that favor structure and control over anything. So like aggregation rules. And then if organizations seek to preserve autonomy, then there should be a higher level of coordination rather than cooperation. And what that is cooperation is kind of sharing responsibility, whereas coordination in this case is more like deconfliction. And rule types that favor those, coordination and deconfliction, should show up if it matches what I'm thinking. And that would come in the guise of more like information rules. And spoiler alert, I didn't, it's kind of mixed results. I find, uh, I don't find that everything is supported, but there is an interesting result. So I'll save that for later. But I use AID network, basically, or sorry, AID framework and action situations, mainly because action situations are very intuitive in this sense in the national security realm, and an interesting way of analyzing the organizational interactions within the national security construct. Um, so I'll tell you how I basically zoom in on these action situations in both the formal and informal networks. I take all the noise out of there and focus in on strategy and how strategy is developed. Because again, we're looking at Afghanistan as a case study and why the strategy might be kind of odd or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, just not clear, right? So you have strategy development, strategy implementation, and strategy assessment. Now, this is kind of similar to if you're talking strategy in any realm, whether it's economics or otherwise in the military, it's the same way. You develop a plan, you implement that plan, and then you assess it to see if it works. And it's kind of an iterative process. So I look for these three and action situations within the legislation and the informal um, interviews, or the interviews that kind of uncover the informal networks. So my research design on this, using action situations, I use the network graphs to visualize the interactions, and then I isolate the strategy action situations, kind of put those into a visual form as well. But also with the networks, I do ergoms that kind of give you their exponential random graph models to kind of analyze each individual network to see if there's reciprocal relationships. So it's really reciprocal or not. So it's kind of looking at the structure of the network and telling you if it can tell you if it's cooperative, coordinative, or not. More likely to be so. And then I kind of take out the rules as well. I look at the dispersion of rules and how they change between the formal and informal networks. Um, all right, so here's where I kind of go into a little bit on the data collection differences, especially when we're talking about the third-party interviews. But obviously, like I said, I use the institutional grammar 2.0 to code those institutional statements from the formal legislation. And also from the national security presidential directives from the Afghanistan period. Those give me the kind of the formal interactions that were supposed to happen, and put those into a network. And then the institutional statements from a selection of the special and inspector general reports or interviews. And I focus on the strategy portions of those. So there are 600 total interviews from the SIGAR data set or grouping of interviews. Luckily for me, that again, they kind of categorized them into strategy and other things. So I picked up the strategy ones, and that gave me 51 interviews to work with. So I focused on those and then separated those into development and assessment. So I identify rule types on each relationship created by the legislation and the directives and the interviews. The networks help me visualize this, and I analyze the networks to give me if there's cooperative or not relationships. And then I do that with all the strategy action situations as well to kind of give me a good picture of what type of rules are shaping the game here. All right, so this is where I kind of break out, and I wanted to pull this out, and I move pictures so I could see here. So here's the challenges with coding a third-party interview. Their interviewer is someone else with different aims. So if I was doing the interview myself, I can set up my interview matrix to look for specific kind of institutional statements, and then kind of follow up on questions if it's missing an element of the syntax. So, but I couldn't do that. So it's another interviewer doing it with different means, different reasons. The researcher, in this case, me, needs to sift through and find the relevant exchanges between the interviewer and the interviewee. So even though I narrowed it down to 51 interviews, I still had to look through those and say, okay, which one of these questions and answers is relevant to what I'm looking at? A lot of it was just blowing off steam or complaining. So those things I had to kind of sift through. And then, as Watkins and Westphal say, people don't talk in institutional statements. So I had to kind of interpret as best I can some of the statements and put them into institutional statements without inferring too much. So there is a danger of saying, well, this is what they say, but I bet they meant this. And if I say, I bet they meant this, and I'm inferring too much. So it's really an art and a science of picking out which statements can be coded. So with that, I give you one example of many that I use. And part of this, you take out one of the steps is taking out the raw statement from the interviews. And then another step is converting it and then coding it like you would a standard institutional statement. So for example, on this top one, and when you go through the interviews, you kind of get the context of it. So you get the players, who's who's talking and who they're talking about. So that's in these brackets. That's what I kind of show here because this was in the previous part of the interview. So I know they're talking about the Department of Agriculture when they say agriculture. Um, so the raw statement was agriculture or the Department of Agriculture never filled its quota of personnel in Afghanistan. So you had military guys, and in this case, they're talking about the military commanders helping Afghan farmers. So to put that in an institutional statement, again, without inferring too much, but to make it a more clear institutional statement, it kind of goes into this converted statement below. The military commanders would assist Afghan farmers at the local level if the Department of Agriculture did not fill its quota of personnel in Afghanistan. So that's kind of the process of it. And again, it's tedious and there's a lot thrown out because there's too much inference sometimes. Um, but with this, my purpose of this was to create a network with connections, connecting, in this case, between the military commanders, Afghan farmers, and Department of Agriculture. So three separate entities that are kind of interacting, and then the rule types that come with that statement. So with that said, and on the right here, this is a picture of my network in a more artistic form. But the network graphs that are created out of these statements tell a story. What I did and what I'm going to show you real briefly, because we could spend hours looking at the eye charts here, but I created overarching parent networks. So all the interactions, say in the national security legislation, or all the interactions with the national security presidential directives, or the informal interviews, I captured all those and put them in a larger network. And then I pulled out smaller networks from that. So kind of subgraphs with the strategy action situations. And I did two of those. I did them aggregated, like all the action situations together to get a picture, and then disaggregated them into the different development, implementation, and assessment. So I kind of went big to small on the network graphs and I basically analyzed the overarching networks and also the aggregated action situations. So there's also descriptive statistics that come with network structure, but there's also analysis from exponential random graph models or ERGMs that can help you kind of compare the parent graph or the graph itself, the actual graph, to a random sampling of graphs that are created via modeling. I use an R package on this with any possible graph that could be made with the same number of nodes. So it's kind of doing that simulation and then picking out random graphs of that kind of structure and comparing it to the actual graph. And then it can show you if your actual graph, how it measures up. Are there more reciprocal relationships than a random graph of the same number of nodes? That's what I'm kind of looking at as well. So descriptive statistics as well as the ERGM models to help me look at things here. So these are just examples, and I showed this before, this eye chart. So this is an example of the national security legislation combined, the National Security Act of 47 and 1986. So it's showing all the players that it mentions, their connections. In this graph itself, the connections are, is it a coordinative or a directive kind of linkage between nodes? Like, are they required to is one node directing another to do something, or are they just coordinating? So that's not really relevant to the rest of this, but I just wanted to explain that here. But centrality of the nodes is significant, or a big deal. So the size of the nodes depicted in the graph itself kind of show who the important players are. In this case, you see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the president, the Secretary of Defense, all the players you'd kind of imagine would be central to it. But you also have outliers that you think would be important, but are not necessarily connected well in this graph, like the Secretary of the Separate Services are kind of on the periphery. And this is that graph kind of distilled down into the strategy action situation. So the previous graph was all of the interactions. This one is just all those strategy interactions. So fewer players, a little bit more condensed, but you still have outliers, you still have central players. And these are all the rule types put together. So from there, again, I distilled it a little bit more, and there's just one example. I like it because it looks like a crab, so I picked this one out. This is I want to say, yeah, this is a strategy implementation action situation. So what it gives you, or what it can show you, is When you disaggregate from there, even it's called faceting this, you could see which rules are more prominent or absent. So aggregation rules are pretty prominent, but information rules are absent, or and payoff rules are absent from all of them. So you can see what's absent, what's there, which rules are more prominent. And also kind of node size tells you the centrality of the players. So this is, I just wanted to show you this because this is what the case study. The top graph is the formal network from the national security presidential directives. And those are the ones that are mandated, not regulated, but kind of the constructed interactions between organizations and the executive branch during the Afghanistan war. Who was supposed to coordinate with who and who was supposed to talk with whom, whether position or organization. The bottom one is the informal network. This comes from all the interactions that I picked out of the SIGAR interviews. So you can see some of the same players, but you can also see new players. And this also goes all the way down to the ground, the operational level, whether it's the embassy or the ground commanders, all the way to the top, which is, the National Security Council staff. So it's obviously a bigger network, has more players, and shows us a little bit more. But from there, from comparing you can visually compare them, but there's also the idea of putting together the descriptive statistics. I copied this comparison graph. I shouldn't say copied. I emulated this graph from Olivier and Schlager from their work in 2019 and 2022. So a way to look at cooperation, bonding characteristics, and bridging characteristics, taking these descriptive measurements from the network analysis. So this itself is not telling me too much. It's showing me that there's more cooperation and coordination baked into the formal networks, which are those top three, and then the informal one, the bottom one. So it's hard to really gauge. There's a lesser degree of, say, coordination within the informal one than the formal ones. But what does that really mean? I kind of combine this with the ERGM results, which again, I don't want to get into the weeds on this, mainly because it might be too much in the weeds. And if I try to remember too much, I'll get things confused. So, because it's been a while. But these networks, again, these are the formal networks of the national security legislation, the combined action situations from the national security legislation, the presidential directives, and then the interviews from the inspector general. And these aren't comparable. They're apples and oranges if you try to compare them. I just put them on one page so we can look at them all at the same time. But it does show, I highlighted the parts where it does show that these graphs, especially the SIGAR interviews or the informal networks, are more likely to have, and sometimes twice as 2 or 3 times as likely to have reciprocating, which is bonding or cooperative interactions than, say, a random graph, a random network from that kind of same set of nodes. So it's telling me there is a significant amount of bonding action going on here. So what does that all mean? I'll get to that in a second. But the other thing I looked at is rule dispersion. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because I want to get to the interesting one too. But on this, I'm looking again at aggregation rules and information rules, and I put them in percentages to show the percentage change between the different networks. So in this sense, for example, information rules increase, or not increase, but there's more of a percentage of information rules in the SIGAR interviews than there are, say, in the formal national security legislation, and definitely more than in the national security presidential directive, which is really the one I want to kind of compare it to oranges to oranges. But what I also did here, so zooming in on the case study of Afghanistan, the top is the formal national security presidential directives, broken down into the 3 action situations, and then the SIGAR interview informal network broken down into the 3 action situations. So in here, there's something I want to point out that's very interesting, in that the formal interactions do not have any institutional statements that pertain to strategy assessment. And they really don't have much in the way of strategy implementation either. They are heavy in strategy development, which kind of makes sense because they are the kind of the overarching organizations at the top level. They're not going all the way down to the field level. But when you look at what's going on with the interviews, there is a gap being filled in strategy assessment and strategy implementation. So rule types of information especially increase in strategy assessment, which shows definitely coordination between the different agencies to try to fill that gap that wasn't necessarily made in the formal networks. So what does this all mean? This is the interesting part, and I kind of highlighted on the bottom here. Holes in the strategy assessment action situation are filled. So what I kind of concluded was the arrangement seems to fill holes regarding assessment and action situation, but also that these networks are kind of ad hoc and they are filling in where the formal networks or the formal interactions leave holes. So they're kind of filling in the gaps, if I keep saying that. How many times I say that, right? So I highlighted here really what I got out of it as interesting. So this idea that ad hoc arrangements within the interagency structure seem to address both cooperation problems, which is trust building, and coordination problems, so deconfliction. So they're addressing both of these. So in this bottom one, ad hoc arrangements fill in holes where necessary, but maybe not in the most effective way. So information sharing rather than action or taking responsibility. So no one was really taking control. There was no assigned responsibility. It was more of this idea of information sharing to get a better picture of things or to deconflict or in some instances to cooperate. See if I got on my next one. If I missed anything here. Okay, my mind was thinking I wanted to go somewhere with that, but I'll catch it later, I'm sure. So limitations in this research, which some of you listening might have picked up on, right? So this research analyzes a broad legislation and directives rather than, I didn't have my hands on the minutia of interagency or internal regulations to a specific department that guides its interactions with other organizations. Those are out there, but some may be classified. Some might just not be able to be released to a researcher without a formal sort of FOIA. So I didn't have all the information. I got what I could in the time that I had. So the scope is limited to the intervening power and counterinsurgency. So what I mean by that is I'm just looking at the United States as an intervening power and an insurgency so I'm kind of blurring out all the other things that matter too, like alliances. We had NATO involved in Afghanistan. That probably had a part to play in some of the non-coordination. The host government itself, which in this case was a kind of a corrupt government, so that was going to add some conflict or some mud to the water. And then I was going to point out here too that there are effects in counterinsurgencies like big terrorist attacks or something like that change how organizations interact with each other, maybe to shore up weaknesses. Things like I kind of think of punctuated equilibrium theory on this one. I didn't take any of that into account or look at any of those external exogenous kind of effects that might have affected the interactions through time. So policy implications on this is one is kind of a well-known one that the Department of Defense does have legislation that legislates or regulates its interactions within that department and say the president or Congress. But there's no legislation that talks about how the interagency should interact. So there's always been calls for this like Goldwater-Nichols Act, which is a reform act for the interagency rather than just the DoD. So it'd be the Department of Defense, State Department, USAID. There's a lot to say there should be legislation that kind of formulates their interactions, which there is not. So this kind of shows too that from the interactions, yes, there is kind of there's not good coordination or cooperation between many of the the departments or agencies within the interagency. There is a hole in how strategy is coordinated in both DoD within the interagency, particularly within the stages of strategy development and assessment. So if I had to take this and give it to a policymaker and say, your biggest deficiencies and organizational interactions are with these two phases, development and assessment. Implementation is fine. So implementation of that is fine. It's just the development and assessment, which could be a problem in itself, right? So that's a policy implication. So contributions that I hope this makes, whether from the dissertation or when I go on to kind of shore it up and maybe publish a chapter or two, is the idea of bridging public policy and national security policy analysis. So I take a lot of theory and a lot of theoretical frameworks, obviously, from public policy, which I think fit really well into national security policy, because it's the same mechanics, just different players and different purposes. So I hope I help bridge that a bit. I know there's been many others who have done that, but hopefully I added to that. And then a network analysis as a tool for examining national security arrangements. So obviously it's been done. Tommy and Adela have done it for water organizations and usages in New York. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, but New York State and New York City, but never really put into looking at national security arrangements, which I think is an interesting way to look at things. And hopefully I added something to that. And then the microdynamics of counterinsurgency in the realm of conflict studies or comparative politics, intergovernmental decision-making mechanisms, something that we don't necessarily look at. We look at crisis situations a lot, say like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the decision to escalate in Vietnam, things like that. We look at those decisions, but never really at the longer term scope or viewpoint. So hopefully I added a little bit something there. Future research in this, what I'm kind of working on here is the second one, how alliances or coalitions affect decision making. So I'm trying to take this method and put it to NATO's constitutive statements and their constitutional kind of documents that form the alliance, and kind of make a network analysis and kind of institutional analysis of that as well. So that's a kind of a heavy lift. Probably have to scope that down a bit. But I also want to look at maybe this in a comparative sense, looking at other nations of similar type, so Great Britain, France, et cetera, that have worked on long-term conflict, and especially counterinsurgencies. There's my timer telling me I'm going too long. So almost finished here. But yeah, I want to take this and kind of compare it to other countries with similar systems to see if there's a similar problems, similar coordination problems, which I'm betting there probably are. But it could be different because they do have different governing systems as well. So that could be a difference. All right. I believe that is it. So I look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this and get it fresh in my mind again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan, for that presentation. I will now open the floor up to any questions from the audience. All right, I see a hand from Juan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Delbert. Thank you, Professor. I really like this project you just presented. I have two questions, one regarding the method and one regarding the policy implication. I'm going to start with the latter. So I think it's very interesting, this conclusion you reach, in which there seems to be like a void in the legislated, in the way the legislation provides a framework for these interactions, and that this becomes like this ad hoc network. My question is kind of the second point there is, if we're designing a good system, like from the get-go, like for creating the institutional arrangement, should we be creating this or putting in place this type of rules for how this network should be interacting? Or do you think it would be strategically also to have this void in order to let the interactions become ad hoc? Because you could argue that maybe defining them beforehand might be might make them more rigid than they should be, especially, I guess, in a counterinsurgents campaign or situation where you need like adaptability, etc. So what do you think about that? So that's question. I'm sorry. Wow. Do you want me to maybe I can ask the second one after you answer?
Okay. Yeah, because my memory is terrible. I'll forget what you asked, but no, that's a good question. And yeah, I think I addressed this a little bit in my dissertation write up, but it's really worth mentioning that you have a great point about flexibility. Decentralizing decision making is essential. You know, that's what I think separates different systems nationally and their effectiveness in, say, conflict. Um, so yeah, absolutely. You cannot say legislate or force interactions to a degree where it's inflexible, that these organizations and departments and even the sub-organizations cannot um, be flexible and fill in gaps where they need to be effective. Um, so in that sense, yeah, it would be a mistake. I would say if I was going to give advice to a policymaker, I'd say that, yeah, that would be a mistake. How too gappy if it were. So when you have this strategy, this kind of iterative strategy process, and there's disconnects where information isn't getting shared, and some points maybe not getting shared on purpose, or maybe certain departments have different ideas of what the strategy should be, so they pursue that strategy rather than an overarching strategy that probably works better or is more integrated, then that causes an issue. So um, I would say where the United States and other governments, in this case, I'm kind of referring to the ones I know best with regards to conflict. So Western European, U.S. systems, they're designed to be flexible, um, especially in conflict. And you see this in some of the major, because they're set up for major conflicts. So country against country. And you see the United States doing pretty well in that sense, or Western Europe. But when it comes to insurgencies and things that have to involve a mix of strategies and outcomes, so not just in this case, not just defeating, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also the idea of uh, recovering an economy if it was there in the first place, or ensuring that there's corruption is minimized in the government. So there's different tasks that need to be done at the same time, but they're all interconnected, and that's where the holes kind of and the gaps tend to produce this idea that uh, there's a circling of the wagons is the way I think about it, of organizations when they say, okay, we're going to do it our way because that's our specialty. We know it better than this organization, so we're going to go forward with our plan. So they're filling a gap where they probably shouldn't fill the gap. There should be some sort of uh, more stringent control in that sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but the the implication of the first part of your question was absolutely right. You can't legislate every little interaction. Otherwise, have a paralyzed system. And this is what happens in some authoritarian states. Um, so I think it's a very good question, and it's right. So you kind of have to thread the needle on this, if that makes
I would
sense.
just like to mention, yeah, yes, it definitely makes sense. You mentioned that earlier in the presentation, if I recall right, that, for example, they're not coming up with responsibilities, with assigning responsibilities. So that may be something that an autonomous, like it wouldn't came ad hoc. So that's what maybe you should be pushing to legislate.
Mhm.
Whereas kind of the way they're going to communicate might be happening, or might be make more sense to leave it. I mean, if you don't legislate it, but I think it's a good point I'm going to be thinking more about.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when you were choosing the notes regarding the method,
Mhm.
so when, for example, you have a specific agency that had several actors, do you code it for each of these actors, or there were places where you had to have like different notes that actually represent the different levels of decision making? For example, you have the president, but you maybe have like the Department of Defense, but within the Department of Defense, there are several offices that might be important. How did you approach that? Sí.
Yeah, I coded everything that was mentioned in the institutional statement. So
Okay.
I didn't leave, if an institutional statement had a position, and that position, or in this case, maybe an attribute or an entity, if they um, if it was definite what that entity was, I'd record that or code it as a node. So there are things like the Department of Defense is mentioned as an attribute, so I put that in there. But also the Secretary, say the Secretary of Defense is mentioned as a position or is created as a position. So I have to put that, I put that node in there as well. So long story short is I didn't want to leave anything out that was mentioned in an institutional statement because I figured that if they mentioned it and put it uh, either a constitutive or regulative statement, then it's important to add to have
That
the
makes sense.
yeah. But I
Thank you
did,
very much.
and that's a good question because I did then, as I was analyzing, I did lump them into say um, organization type. So like for Afghanistan, I'd have um, those organizations focused on security, those focused on economy. So I did kind of lump them when I did analyze via the ergom to see if that made a difference at all. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dan?
If I may.
Yeah, of course.
Please feel me. Hi, hello. My name is Naida, and I'm
Hi.
doing a PhD at Loyola University, Chicago. I'm also working on bureaucracies and decision making in bureaucracies, but in migration regime. And this was a very interesting presentation for me because I have a couple of questions, and I apologize for not reading your thesis in advance. I've just found it online, so maybe reading it would answer the question. Um, I was wondering first, how did you define decision making in this context or decision making processes? How did you define them, and what did you define as an outcome of the decision making process? And I wanted to know more about the use of Seltnick model to explain bureaucratic behavior. Why that model and not some other ones? And do you think it's would you say that it's certainly most used, but would you say that's the most convenient model to describe decision making, to use decision making, or no?
Yeah, very good questions. I think um, a member of my dissertation committee asked that exact question about the models. So it's a good question. And this is another to start with your first one. I don't think I define decision making. So that's a good point, especially if I go forward and set this forward for publication. But um, I think how I infer decision making in this, and maybe it comes through in the writing, but who is basically who is connected to who, and who in that interaction has either the control or not. Um, and so who else, like in the action situation, who is involved in that action situation? So in that sense, it's like the action situation is the decision making model.
Mhm.
And so in this case, you see a lot of holes in at least in mine. So there's no payoff rules, or like there's no or else's statements. So it's kind of like an open-ended thing. And then scope is kind of where you kind of look at the outcomes. What are the outcomes defined in that action situation? And a lot of cases there weren't outcomes defined until you get to the informal interviews where they work together to say, okay, this is the outcome we're looking for. So I think your question was basically how did I define an outcome, or how did I look for it?
What is the outcome of a decision making
Oh,
for
yeah,
you? I mean, we know that it's a decision, but what is the formal output?
that's a good question, and I don't think I actually define that specifically. So if I try to formulate an answer here, it'd probably be convoluted. But um, the outcome in general for this was the strategies,
Okay.
the connectedness, or unified nature of the strategies. So was there a unified agreement on what a strategy should be, or the outcome of, say, the development, implementation, or assessment phase? So for example, in strategy implementation, the outcome for a specific thing might be, hey, the reconstruction teams are going to ensure that there's a hospital, a school, or something in this village. And that might be the outcome that is shared by the State Department and USAID, whereas the Department of Defense is looking at security for that village and sees the outcome as different, as not building this infrastructure, but ensuring that the Taliban, in this case, would not infiltrate or something. So when you have two outcomes that are different, sometimes they cross wires or go crosswise, and they counteract each other or contradict each other in a way. So I was looking at the strategy outcomes really as like, what was the purpose of the strategy development? For the legislative part of it, it's kind of written out. It's saying we are creating this legislation to create coordination between the agencies and departments under the executive branch.
Okay.
So that's an overarching outcome that that they're telling you is going to happen. So I'm kind of, when I do that, I'm challenging it. Like, is that truly what the outcome is? Or, is the institution designed for that to actually happen or not? And others before me, like Amy Zagart, had goes into that in depth and has the answer that no, they're not designed for that outcome. So, and then the Selznick model.
Yes.
Yeah. So the Selznick, I've gone through a lot of organizational theory, bureaucratic organizational behavior, and I came across his model via, I think, March and Olson, maybe. So had done a simplified version. I might be misreferencing that. But when I first saw the simplified model and explanation, I thought it fit better than anything, because I was looking at, okay, these organizations get specialized. And when they're specialized, they tend to hold on to their turf. And if other organizations are specialized in another area, but there's a little bit of overlap, then they kind of compete a bit. And that's kind of what the Selznick model was discussing a bit. So it was kind of this fight for autonomy that got to me, that kind of matched what I was looking at within the national security construct, if that makes sense. So if I was looking at another construct, maybe it might not have made as much sense, but I think for this national security architecture and construct of bureaucracy, it made sense for me to say, it seems like it's explaining a lot of what the behavior is looking like. So I kind of went with that and then modified it myself a bit by bringing in the informal rules and formal rules into it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Can I just have a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
But in Selznick model, I guess the problem I have, not the problem, the question I have with it is that the organizations, or they don't necessarily have to compete. They can also cooperate, right? Right. And it somehow doesn't address that question of cooperation. And I'm just thinking, if we address the alternative scenario where the cooperation, instead of only competition is possible, then wouldn't we be able to come up with more or else statements?
More or else statements?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that also this model fits the scenario of cooperation and not competition only?
Do I think it fits that? I think it could. So in the sense of cooperation, it fits it because the overarching organization is passing down, at least how I modified it, is passing down formal rules that define the institution, like the institutional cooperation, or not organizational cooperation. So in that sense of the model, yeah, it can, but it's not voluntary, say, cooperation, unless there's and there's a good, you're bringing up a memory I have of the dissertation write-up is that
Mhm.
you do have smaller organizations that aren't as, say, powerful, that do need to cooperate. So they do need to team up with other organizations to address a collective action issue. So I think I put, and my memory is very vague on this. So if it's not in the dissertation, you can write me up and say you need to put this in there. But yeah, as I thought about it too, yeah, there are times where organizations within the bigger construct need to cooperate just because they can't do it on their own. And that showed up in the informal ones within the Afghanistan case study, because a lot of these, like the Department of Defense, could not reconstruct Afghanistan just via its design and mission. Whereas you needed USAID, you needed State Department, you needed the local players. So in that sense, they kind of created the cooperation work where it was missing otherwise. But I think that's a really good question. I'm going to have to revisit that too and make sure I'm thinking about that correctly. But I think that's good. Good question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we have reached the top of the hour, so I think we will wrap it up there. So I just want to thank Dan one more time for coming on this month and presenting his work. And thank you to all of you for attending and for asking your questions. And we will see you next month.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, everyone. I appreciate your questions and attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you
a good
very
day.
much. Have a good
Bye-bye.